Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith.
And I'm Jacob Keynes, and you are listening to the Classical Queer Podcast. Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Classical Queer Podcast. We are so thrilled to be joined by Zachery Meier, who is a composer and flutist. Though I always ask, do you go by flutist or flautist? That's maybe our first question.
So I had a couple of professors that had educated myself on what the difference was. Very strong opinions on it is flutist rather than flautist. Ooh. And flout coming from like old terminology of like to joke around or to be like a jester. So they were very strong advocates for flutists rather than flautists, even though personally I like the way flautist sounds.
It's a much more fun word, but we'll go with flutist. And so we generally begin these podcasts with a very informal bio that can be entirely of your choosing. Tell us about yourself, where you are, what you do, how you've come to what you do, and how you've come to where you are. And maybe we'll start there.
A really simple question, right? Very straightforward.
Yeah. Tell us your entire life's history, and then we'll start.
Perfect. Well, I was a band kid when I was growing up, band and orchestra. I played the flute, the saxophone in the jazz band, and violin in the orchestra. So I've always had kind of an inherent want of being musical and being expressive. I think a lot of it actually had to do with not to get too into the weeds, but a lot had to do with like identity. I felt I belonged in the orchestra and the band, and dealing with a lot of personal things in that kind of adolescent high school time. I never felt like I had to justify anything in band and orchestra. So I felt a really strong community there. And I think that's what really drew me into music being what I wanted to go into later on in life. And I had some really excellent teachers. And I think that was another reason why I wanted to also kind of give back to the profession in that way of wanting to be an educator. I moved into doing a flute performance undergraduate that merged into a composition career after sharing some pieces that I had written with some of my composition colleagues. And they really encouraged me to submit a portfolio together to the composition professor. And he said, yeah, come on in. Let's see where this will go and where this will take you. And then went off to a master's degree at Washington State University for composition focus or concentration. And then finishing up my PhD currently at the University of Iowa for music composition as well. I will actually be submitting my thesis in like 5-6 days.
Wow.
So, fingers crossed, send me all the energy and the coffee you can muster together. But all of that, I'm also teaching at Denison University in a very small town outside of Columbus, Ohio, called Granville, Ohio. And the music theory kind of fundamentals course teacher. I teach the computer music courses, a queer studies course in music and sexuality, and then I teach private composition lessons as well. Hopefully that says a lot.
Well, how did you choose your instruments? I mean, you said you played the flute. I was going to say the flout there, but the flute, the saxophone, and the violin. I mean, how did you were they ones you just chose or picked up or?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have contrary to what my father would like to believe, I don't have that many musical people in my family. He does like to sing a tune every now and then, and he's dabbled in some composition. But I think it was in elementary school, they had like a choose your instrument day, and they would have all the instruments laid out. And maybe it wouldn't be super great post-COVID the way that we did it back then, but you would just pick up the instrument and play it and be like, oh yeah, this one seems like it works and fits. And I was, for some reason, just very interested in the flute. I don't know if it was like kind of the queer aspect of, ooh, a male flutist, or, I'm a boy, I shouldn't like the flute. And so that's why I was super drawn to maybe the soprano instruments. And I think that's why I chose the violin as well. And saxophone, I think just because all the cool kids were playing the saxophone in the jazz band. So I was like, there we go.
And still do. I mean, I can appreciate that you went immediately for the subversive male playing flute aspect. I do really appreciate that. I will say when we did a very similar thing when we were choosing instruments. I'm a clarinetist, and we affectionately called it the instrument petting zoo, which maybe adds another weird layer to that whole experience of picking instruments. But when you started playing flute, you started playing in band, and you were saying that it was a like kind of wonderful safe space for you. And I had a really similar experience. I mean, my time in band world was a lovely space where it kind of didn't feel like the real world. You could kind of remove yourself from whatever else was happening in school and go to band. And I'm curious when you started. Like, so how old were you? And describe your band history. Like, tell us a bit about it.
Yeah. So the band program there started in 5th grade in elementary school. And I actually grew up in a small town that had one public school and then 2 private schools. And I was fortunate enough to go to one of those private schools. And I think we had to travel over to the elementary school. So they had these like group of 5th graders that would walk over to the elementary school where the band program was. And we started there, and 5th, 6th grade were in the elementary school. And then 7th grade actually started junior high school. So then everybody in the elementary school, private and public schools, would then go to the public high school. And then I played in band from 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, trying to beat the one first chair flute player that I never got to beat. I was always second chair. But
and where are they now, though? That's the question.
Yeah.
I think she went to go study in equine science.
Oh, right.
I haven't really
doing fine.
So she might be doing pretty well. She might be doing okay.
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about instruments. I mean, the school I was at, everyone had to play an instrument, and so there was a mad rush for the instruments, and they had a lot of violas because all schools play violas in Eastern England. Nobody plays violins; they play violas, and what was it? Cornets. They had lots of cornets for people to play. And then by the time I got there was only 2 instruments left, and one was the oboe and one was the flute. And I went with the oboe, but I mean, it was kind of like nobody wanted either of them because they weren't real instruments or whatever. I don't know, but anyway. So, and I was always third oboe, which was really bad because there were only 2 oboes in the orchestra, so I didn't even get to play. They made special parts. You had one note every 15 minutes, So there you go. Thank you. Applause later. Yeah. But yeah, so maybe for people who aren't very familiar with kind of what you mean by band, because there's kind of different in different parts of the world, there's a different meaning for that. So when you see band, I mean, when I hear band in America, I always think of marching bands, which is not what you mean. But so what this is like what we would call orchestra or something.
So
Its name.
Like the orchestra, for me, there's like full orchestra, which would be all of the string instruments, the violin, the violas, the cellos, the double bass. And then they've got the winds, brass, and percussion section. So that would be full orchestra. And then string orchestra, just meaning the string section. Yeah. So then the band would be essentially that kind of wind, brass, and percussion section as their own ensemble, which they sit like an orchestra versus like the marching band, which would have similar instrumentation, but moving and doing all their shenanigans. And I was also a piccolo player in the marching band for too many years. But the piccolo was a lot of fun because I always would see, they would always put us for some reason next to the tubas, which is the largest of the instruments. And I was like, that would not be fun to carry around. I'm really glad I've got this maybe 2-pound instrument that I get to hold up.
Every time I think of that, I just think of these kinds of like somebody, like what is it that playing the American, I don't know, independence thing, walking along playing the piccolo and all this kind of thing. I have that kind of vision with it. It's kind of very strange instrument, if you don't mind me saying so.
No, absolutely. Kind of like fife and drum, where they've got like the drums along the small piccolos, and then of course the famous Stars and Stripes Forever piccolo solo, which is played every 4th of July.
That's what I was thinking of. Yeah. Well, you'll always get a job there. You can always play that every 4th of July. You'll be in big demand. So
I have guaranteed employment once a year. I think it's a pretty good.
I am always fascinated by. So I wrote my master's thesis on American band in the like 50s and 60s, and I wrote it because I have such a fascination with like the idea, like Sammy, your idea of like American marching band, because it's so close to us, and it is not a thing in any way, shape, or form. In Canada, we do not have marching band. The idea of marching band is like completely and utterly foreign to us. The idea of walking outside with an instrument and getting that, frozen to your face is horrifying. And so I always actually kind of love hearing about American marching band world and people playing their piccolo and then switching to flute for like inside band, for like actual sit down band. When you write, so you've written a fair amount of flute music. Do you do that intentionally, or is that just like a nice common thing? Do you write for yourself a lot of the time? What do you write for?
It's a good question. Up until recently, actually, like the last 3 years, I had only written one piece for the flute, and it was a flute choir piece. Really, because I was scared as a flutist myself. There seemed, and just it was definitely self imposed kind of pressure that it should be good, that it should be some of the best music that you write, because you're so intimately aware of what the flute can and can't do. And I think it took me a while to get comfortable with my own composition voice, to see how I could then, I can finally invite the flute into this world. And I've actually, a few of the pieces that I've shared are some of my favorites that I've written. And I think it was a good thing that I did wait. So it wasn't until recently I've got a few pieces there, and then a number of new commissions that I have coming out in the next couple of months for flute that I'm looking forward to. I don't write for myself necessarily, but I do play everything that I've written, just to make sure, like, okay, is this comfortable? What can I do with this technique? And I usually have to make a couple little videos of some of the techniques I'm using, just because they're not that common with some of the flute players that I'm writing for. But they're not extraordinarily difficult. It's just, this is what I'm talking about when I say move the embouchure and then do this thing with your fingers. And embouchure just meaning what or how you play the flute with the shape of your lips and what they do. So I definitely
Sorry, go on. No, carry on. Sorry.
I was just gonna say I definitely try to make sure that they're playable and that I can play them, but I also get some stage fright of playing too much. So
I was just going to say, because this fascinates me, this lip movement. It sounds a bit odd, but it's because we're going to hear in some of the music, and maybe we'll talk about that. It's not what you would call, to the uneducated, conventional flute sounds. They're kind of different, and they have a different quality and this kind of thing, which all comes from, I guess, how you move your lips and mouth. And kind of so for the uneducated, tell us a little bit about that, because that kind of fascinates me, how you come up with that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So a lot of my studies have kind of been in more traditional composition writing in my undergrad, which I didn't mention, but the minute you brought up the piccolo playing in the frozen tundra, I went to my undergrad in Duluth, Minnesota, which I did a number of times have maybe like a 2-3 inch icicle at the end of my piccolo after marching band practice. So I remember those days intimately. But I think with a lot of my flute study, a number of lessons were used on like the shapes that you make in your mouth and the formants for vowel shapes and consonants actually being a part of the practice and the pedagogy for flute playing. But I didn't see a lot of that specifically written in a lot of flute music. It was mostly tone colors. This is the way that we want the flute to sound in this section, so you'll do this with your mouth, or you'll make this kind of consonant shape because we really want this percussive sound. And for me, I wanted to kind of bring those two worlds together as an actual composition practice and put some of those ideas of speech in the way that we think about our mouth shape into some of the flute music in, I think, an organic but really beautiful way, with also intention of it maybe having another level of importance, whether it be to the program note or whether it to be to the flutist that's kind of exploring and discovering this piece. I think that's kind of how I approach that idea.
We should listen to what you're talking about. So maybe we should start with Hiraeth, and you can tell us maybe about what we're going to hear in this piece. So it's trio for 3 flutes that uses a lot of these techniques. It uses a lot of these things that you're describing. So tell us maybe specifically in this one what we're going to hear.
Perfect. In this flute trio, I was hoping to explore the idea of nostalgia. I think I put that in a little bit of a program note, but ever since a lot of the attacks on the queer community, specifically in like queer nightclubs and queer social spaces, I've felt this, lack of a better word, nostalgia for these like spaces that I grew up in my younger, like kind of 20, 21, 22 years of being able to just fully express yourself. So the nostalgia, the word itself is Welsh, meaning kind of this homesickness for a place that maybe had never been, or maybe was but never will be again. I don't know if those spaces will ever, in my brain, go back to being kind of those safe, at least in my realm, those safe spaces. We'll move forward in other ways. But to get back to the piece, I try to work with this really delicate, really soft music that almost resembles pitch or has like these bits of pitched music in them by using different shapes of the flute and by using different air effects over the flute to kind of give this like reminiscent of this could have been or this might have been pitch material, or things that are transition into new pitch material or new ideas, to kind of give this idea of the flexibility of this space, or that kind of flux in regular pitch or air, and kind of this in-between area. And then it eventually moves into kind of this lilting melodic and then rising section into kind of just like a beautiful remembrance for all of these things. So hopefully you get to hear some of those, and that kind of registers in the music itself.
I think we should take a listen to that.
It's always interesting hearing what a composer had thought about when they were writing, and then what you kind of hear in your own, even having read your description. And it's so interesting that illuminates so much for me about the piece. Maybe not questions I had about what was happening or maybe why, but it makes it so much more palpable and real about why those sound choices were what you chose. And it really adds so much depth to the piece in general. And I think that the beginning especially, I remember the first time I was listening to it, and I listened to it 2 or 3 times, that breathy, really subtle, tiny beginning now makes so much more sense to me about why you chose that and how we kind of grow out of that. Maybe tell us about how you wrote that, in the sense of, did you experiment with it? Did you play it? Did you like tease it out? Because it sounds a little teased out.
Definitely. I mean, you nailed it on the head. I literally was in the moment trying to, like, I grabbed my flute and I was like, all right, we got to write this flute trio. It's due in like a month and a half. I gotta come up with something. And I had these little sketches that I had made. I try to keep close to my desk this little sketchbook of just ideas. So if I'm working on something and it doesn't quite work for that piece, I'll jot it in there just to have them. So I did have this like broken apart melody that I was like, I'll use it for something. And then maybe it goes with that nostalgia or like something from the past, like coming back into the piece. I then just like kind of fluctuated that air in this tone and this pitch and tore apart the melody and started just kind of piling on top of these tone clusters, and then thinking about that kind of wispy wind sound, put those together. And so I actually have a mock-up of the piece with on Logic is the DAW that I use, the digital audio workstation, and I have 3 tracks, and I just kind of improvised off of each of those tracks. I put my headphones on, my microphone, and I was just like, I'm going to play, and then I'm going to put on another layer. And then I kind of started splicing and putting things on top of each other. It's not the normal workflow, but I think at that moment when I had the flute available to me, I was just like, well, why not just use the sounds that I'm going to use anyway, rather than just trying to imagine everything inside the notation. So yeah, definitely.
So when you, I mean, you said that's a little bit different workflow. So where do you, what is your workflow normally? I mean, are you sort of one of these people who comes up and sort of, is it very precise, very detailed, or do you start big and work your way down? I mean, how do you is your workflow?
That's a great question. As for like the actual getting into writing the music itself, it changes for almost every piece on how I approach those. But usually the way that I can get into the composition practice is having some general narrative. So for this one being something about nostalgia, for the flute and trombone piece, it was for the political kind of policies that were happening. So there's usually some kind of story, whether or not I'm trying to actually put that programmatically in the music, or just a way of thinking about, okay, what kind of sounds do I associate with this idea, or what kind of mood or textures, feelings, techniques do I want to incorporate? And then I usually do a little bit of a Venn diagram of like, okay, well, what does the flute do? What does it do really well? How does that actually intersect with the topic, with the idea? And then for this one, it was then picking up the flute, throwing a bunch of recordings together to try to figure out what I liked. For other, it's sitting at the piano and maybe dabbling out some notes so that I can get at least pitch material. And then I'll go into the computer and start putting those in to the program.
So, I mean, do you think of yourself as very, I don't know how to put this in a way, with the artists that you get to play, and when you obviously play yourself, are you fairly controlling over what they do, or do you like to allow them to have some freedom, and this, or is it variable depending on the piece?
I absolutely adore true collaborations. So I'll bring material to the performer and I'll say, hey, can we explore this together? Like, I'll have some pitch material. I'll have this rhythmic idea, but I'm like, what if we just played with this idea for a little bit? And I'll like record some ideas, write down some ideas, and kind of build the piece together with that performer. Depending on the timeline, sometimes I do like to have a little bit more time so I can work with people. But if it's a short notice, it's maybe one or two of those sessions, and then I have just got to write the piece. Usually when it's done, though, I do ask them, if there's anything in there that you want to invest in more, take moments or take time to maybe improvise a little bit in it. That might not be always true with a lot of composers, but I think as a person, as a queer person, I've learned to adapt, but I've also learned to love the idea of the collaboration and the connection with people. And I really lean in hard on any time that I get to actually work with people rather than working for a paycheck or working for a project that, I just got assigned, or working on an assignment for students. I really, really like working with humans and what they bring to the table and their own musicality. Yeah, I think it shines more into the exchange, than to just hand them a piece of paper and be like, play this. I wrote everything out perfectly. Don't mess up. I think that's so inorganic and unlike the human experience. So I'd rather invite those in a little bit more.
It's really interesting you say that. I have the pleasure of working with like a number of composers kind of monthly, and through this talking with exclusively queer people, but then outside of like this project and my other kind of queer doings, I guess, but outside of those things, I work with like a lot of straight composers just in my day job. And it's really interesting that you say that collaboration and working with the person is much more important to you than a paycheck or a gig or a commission, or not that making money isn't important, but it's interesting.
Don't get me wrong.
That no. If you want to pay me, by all means,
it's fine.
Sure. But it's interesting that I don't want to say never, but I rarely hear that outside of queer composers. But I hear it a lot from queer composers, that it's much more interesting for people to work with people, to collaborate, to you say adapt, to listen to the other person. And I think that's such a hallmark of I don't think there's a way to distill down queer composition necessarily, but like such a hallmark maybe of writing while queer, that there is so much more adaptation, collaboration, conversation, so much more of the person involved. Have you experienced that outside of your writing when you're working? Do you work with queer performers as well?
I did get a really beautiful opportunity to work with Nick May, saxophonist in Kansas City, who's an absolute lovely human being. And if you ever get a chance to meet him, throw him all the money you possibly can, because he's doing the work. But I've recently been trying to do more of that, working with other queer musicians, composers, improvisers, or quote unquote performers in the more strict sense. And I've noticed the willingness to take the time to make the piece is a little bit different with queer musicians. And I think that has something to do with the experience that we've had to have a certain kind of patience in life, and not to learn to shy away from that, but leaning in on that and being empathetic to the creative process has been, I think, an interesting revelation of working with queer artists. And not, like you said, and not to exclusively say that doesn't happen with non-queer artists, but it's interesting that the needle goes further when you work with a queer artist in that way.
I think that that's kind of true of probably all interactions, not just in the music community. That you just being in the queer community, you do interact more, and you do actually are in those spaces more, and you tend to sort of be there more. So I kind of think it's part of the human condition, if you like, to actually seek out people, and actually when you find people, you sort of latch onto them a bit, and you go, hey, yeah, we've got similar experiences. So I think it's kind of a thing. You mentioned Nick May. So we had Nick on here a couple of months ago, actually, and a brilliant discussion with me. Absolutely wonderful guy. And that it's a beautiful segue into this piece with Love from the Other Side, which is for the soprano saxophone, and is actually part of the I Exist project, which we talked a little bit about. So a little bit about background about this piece of music.
Absolutely. I got connected with Nick actually through social media. We didn't know each other before this collaboration, and now he's such a close friend of mine after this project that I think it was really beneficial socially, musically for both of us. The piece itself, Nick had approached me and said, hey, I'd love for this I Exist project, I'd love if you would be interested in contributing to the repertoire for solo saxophone. And he said it could be for alto saxophone, soprano, alto and piano, electronic, like whatever. The world is yours in that regard. And I hadn't written something for solo soprano saxophone yet. And I was really interested in this like really beautiful timbre and tone that Nick has in his playing. It's phenomenal. And I approached the project not really having quite any subject matter at the time. And Nick had said, here's the things that people have done kind of based on queer experiences. And we kind of leaned in on the fact that we didn't talk a lot about kind of queer suicide or queer self-harm. And so I really wanted to approach that delicately, and I wanted to approach that with great honor and respect for how emotionally heavy that topic could be. So I was thinking there isn't a lot of, and once again, I don't want this to be a blanket statement, but there aren't a lot of queer people that I know that haven't experienced some kind of dark moments in their life and some kinds of things that have drawn them to an edge of some kind. And so I wanted to write a piece that was kind of an anthem to that experience and send some kind of respect and love from the other side, of saying on the other side of those situations, you have a community that's here for you. You have a community that will love you and respect you and hold space for you. And so the beginning of at the start of the piece, or actually the composition process, I wrote a hymn that I didn't show anybody. It's just in the program note, and it's just for Nick and myself or whoever decides to play it again. But in the piece, I take that hymn and I break it into a billion different little pieces, and I just give these little hues of it throughout as a way of saying, even in these dark moments, there's still going to be this community that's always going to be able to reach out and come back to you. There's this hymn that's this anthem coming back each time to kind of remind you that the queer community is big. There are lots of different places in the queer community that you can belong to, and that you'll also have that support on the other side.
Let's take a listen.
I think it's lovely that we get to listen to Nick again. I think this is a nice connect. It again, I am struck by how wonderful it is to hear the piece now with the understanding of how you wrote it compositionally, which is, maybe the musicologist in me, that it deepens my love for anything when I understand it. But compositionally, it also kind of features some interesting like shapes and sounds. And so maybe you can tell us a bit about those as well. So you have this hymn that you deconstructed.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. But maybe tell us a bit about how that deconstruction unfolds, like through some of those kind of saxophony specific things.
Yeah. The process was, I did want to find this kind of misty space. I feel like I've given you two pieces that kind of live in this like misty, nostalgic space. And that's, I think, just what I'm really interested in at the moment in the last couple years of composing. And so I really wanted to work with the kind of shimmer that could happen with what's called a timbral trill. It's where they play the same note, but they'll do two different fingerings for it. So you get a slight variance in what happens in the sound, kind of like a wiggle in the sound wave. And I think that's really what the beginning kind of expresses and works on, is this idea of this in-between space, this space of like existence and what's somewhat out there. And so I work with that idea, these shimmering effects, these air effects, as kind of just a way of getting into this world that we can live in, this kind of middle ground of not to be like life and death, but kind of like this edge of where we're at, that we're not quite feeling like we belong, but we're not also quite to the edge, and kind of dropping off in that way. So throughout the piece, I try to take this and either enter in from that space and then give a little bit of the hymn and enter back out, or just really exist and live in that kind of middle area, and then allow some of the pitch material to kind of enter in either organically or inorganically by creating some of the interjections from that misty place.
For me, it was kind of interesting because of it made me feel pretty much this idea that you live in a community, at least I do, which is not your community, and you interact with that community all the time. And then there's these bright spots of you find your community, and it may be for a weekend or a day or somebody you meet in the street, and that's kind of, I'm kind of echoing what you said. I'm sorry, I'm kind of repeating, but it was those moments of a sort of lucid sort of sound, which makes you think, okay, wow, we're now, and look, we're out again of this sort of thing. So it was, for me, it was kind of interesting, like almost searching type feeling of trying to find something. And then when I read the notes, it was, oh yeah, I see now. But it's this search for something, a space or a place where you feel comfortable. So it was, yeah, I really, and I loved the beginning of it as well, with all these, as you say, unusual notes in this. And this is one of the reasons I was kind of fascinated about how you make those things and the different notes and this kind of stuff. It was really interesting to watch and listen to. So
it's wonderful. And he's a phenomenal player. So I was really extraordinarily grateful, because he also brought in a couple of these, like I had these ideas, and he's like, well, what about this? What if we try this? And I was like, that's it. That's exactly. So I think that's also the connection of like my own imagination with someone who's just so profoundly intimate with that instrument and knows all of the insides and outs, to be able to like really help bring that alive. I think is really important. And of course, immediately when you said the searching and the finding of the community, that is absolutely inside that piece as well. It's really beautiful that you found that.
This brings us to the next piece of music, which is Hush. And this has an unusual, for me, combination of instruments, the flute and the trombone, which are not two that I think of as going together particularly. So I think this needs some explanation, I think, Zachery, of how this came about.
But why not? That's really the explanation. No.
Yeah, you're probably right. It shouldn't be like that, but it's kind of, it's just kind of when it came out, flute and trombone, I was thinking, flute and trombone, they're kind of like,
what's happening here?
Yeah.
No, absolutely. When I got the request from two very beautiful women and colleagues in my life, I was like, what in the world is someone going to do with flute and trombone? Like, what have I gotten myself into? I also had another commission for tuba and tenor voice. And I'm like, you guys, we got to get together and we got to talk about the pairings that we're making these days. I know we're all trying to be unique, but there's a composer named Nicole Chamberlain who had written a piece called Whale for flute and trombone. And so they had played that piece and they were like, there needs to be more repertoire for this. And of course, I then get asked to help with that expedition for new repertoire. So really it was just born out of this duo that I actually did my master's degree with one of them. I was getting my master's degree. She was teaching at the university, the trombonist there. And a couple years ago had asked me, they're like, hey, we're going to put a recital together. We'd really love another piece to accompany this so that we can actually make it kind of a chamber ensemble and a chamber portion of the concert. And I said, all right. And I asked them, like, do you have any ideas of what you'd like to do? Do you have any like topics or anything? And they're like, not really. It's really up to what you want to do. And so that was really when a lot of things were happening in kind of the States. Not to say still isn't anything kind of important, but a number of things were happening to reproductive rights in the United States with the Supreme Court decisions and states' decisions and whatnot. And so I, as a strong advocate for autonomy and, plain and simple, people should have autonomy on their own bodies. And I think from a queer perspective, that's absolutely essential. I think there's no questioning there. So I think that was also helpful for me to kind of enter in that as also having autonomy as just a human being. And then on top of it, the added layer of the government getting in the way of that autonomy. Not to say it's not the first time, but that was kind of where my idea was born out of for the piece. And also two very enormously talented flute and trombone player that happened to be women. In the flute world, that's very common. It's not very common to have a flute or a female trombone instructor. And there's not a lot of female representation in low brass, which would be, I guess I should say brass in general. A lot of it in trumpet, trombone, tuba, even in the French horn world, less so in the French horn world. But I felt like it was a nice opportunity to have kind of this strength and female representation in the piece.
But in the notes, it says, it talks about the attack on reproductive. Okay, and then it has Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So being a big Buffy fan, you have to explain how Buffy gets into this song. So
I am an adjacent Buffy fan. I love everything about it, but the repertoire of Buffy episodes are not in my wheelhouse. They are. I'm changing it. I'm working on it. Get on it. But there was a particular episode named Hush that they absolutely enjoyed. And they both looked at each other and they were like, this is what the piece has to be about. And so they texted me after they told me I had free reign on it. They were like, hey, by the way, I don't know if you've seen Buffy, but like this is a really cool episode and we'd really like to do something kind of inspired by this. And I watched the episode and I was just like, this absolutely fits, actually. It was I think they're called the Gentlemen, who came into this town and they stole the voices out of everybody in town. And then you couldn't get your voice back until these hearts were procured from people, taken out of their chest at the end. And then they would get what they need. Some people die, and I think they gave the voices back and whatnot. But Buffy came in to the rescue, as she always does, as it should be. and stopped them before all of this could happen, or I guess the final whatever was going to happen. So this idea of like losing or being your voice being taken from you without choice, I think really hit home once again as a queer person. It's something I think a lot of us deal with on a daily basis, that we don't really have the same, not always the same kind of power. And I think that's been a running line with a lot of female identifying individuals in higher ed, in large corporations, on a day-to-day, in the government. I mean, we could name everything by saying it was, I think, a piece that was then born out of giving them their voice back or finding their voice. The beginning, once again, kind of works with the same similar aesthetic and material that I do with a lot of my music, by like getting into this misty kind of voiceless idea and area of like the voices being taken from you, and then them slowly finding their voices back toward the end. Additionally, the trombone and the flute, I really tried to find ways in which their ranges, where they actually play their instruments, were similar. So I know the flute kind of comes down to a range and the trombone can come up enough, that I tried to live in that area a little bit where their voices were unified, but then eventually they split apart and they can be in their own realms, their own areas. 9, it was a big number, and I think 7, 9 and 7s are everywhere in there for the 7 gentlemen, and then the 9 Supreme Court justices kind of being in control of things. So it's always nice from a composer standpoint to find those kinds of things, because that can directly relate to just musical material. Without it, I try not to get too kind of cheesy with it, to be like, well, that D sharp is that person. I should say not particular, to imply that to anybody's composition as is welcomed, I should say. But for me, I try to be a little bit more, I allow some of that material to be a little bit more open to interpretation.
Let's take a listen.
Hush, I am also like a particular fan of trombone and flute. There are very few, but the number of times I've heard it together as a duo actually works so well, and this is such a like another great example. And I will be passing this on to my colleague who is next door, who is a trombone player, and she is a fantastic advocate for new music and often plays things with flute. And so I will pass this on to Shauna.
I
Shauna, the
appreciate that.
wonderful
Thank you.
trombonist.
Is that on the name placard? Shauna the
Yeah,
wonderful,
Shauna the wonderful trombonist. Exactly. And I hope she can find a place to play it, and I hope she like reaches out to you and finds a way to do it. But it's a rare combo, but it's a beautiful combo. Clearly, it works really nicely together.
I think there's a lot of. It took me a minute to kind of sit down and listen. I tried to listen to some. I already knew a decent amount of flute repertoire, but tried to really listen to trombone repertoire closer than I would before, to really find where those really tender moments are in both of those instruments. So hopefully that got captured a little bit in there.
Yeah,
I think one of the things that when you look at this, for somebody who isn't a musician, you always think of the trombone playing these very raucous sort of, we're marching array with all these sort of Suzery sort of things and this. So hearing it in a different context was actually really, really interesting, I think. So I think I learned a lot about what you can do with the trombone from listening to this. So it was kind of nice. I mean, just one thing about all three pieces that we've heard is clearly it's that they're all very motivated by a sort of compassion, empathy with and community and sort of political awareness, shall we say, or whatever you want to use for a term in this sort of thing. Is this, I mean, obviously this is very important to you in your life. So how do you think it affects this question we often ask? How do you actually, I mean, obviously it does, it affects your music in a great deal. But in what way do you feel, what does it do for your music being part of the community?
I'm relatively soft-spoken out in the kind of the real world, and it is a part of me that I'm actively trying to make less soft-spoken, so that maybe some real change can happen in either my local community or in things otherwise. But I feel my biggest contribution is really on the stage, in the program notes, in the music community. We've made, I think, really great strides for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I still think that there's room for more. I still think that the programming of particular ensembles still needs to expand further. And I think, without trying to make it, the queer trope of like, oh, it's the queer music, he's going to make queer music. The female flutist is going to play female composers. I feel the work for that is still necessary. And I think it affects what I want in music and how I write my music and what I think about in music and how I like to listen to music, to make sure that I'm hyper aware of what's around me and what I'm trying to do and what I want to contribute into music. And I think every composer, every musician, and even every a person wants to find the purpose in life. And I feel like this is really a strong value of mine as a queer person, to be outwardly. I've got rainbows everywhere in my office. I've got a pride flag on my door, to just be as loudly queer as I can, and be also kind to myself, to not push myself further than I'm comfortable with at the moment. So I think that's why I've leaned into queer, at least queering my music and making things that I can queer related or identity related.
I think it's really easy to go too extreme sometimes. I mean, I find this, I do tend to get very carried away into a space where maybe I don't feel so comfortable in the community. So it is important to look after yourself. So what's next? What's your next big thing besides your thesis? Your thesis going in 6 days, yeah, which you will then be doctored, and then where do you go after that? Yay!
The graduation for that, I'll be here at Denison University teaching, and then this summer I was invited to the National Flute Association in San Antonio, Texas.
Oh, right.
For the
it's in Texas though, so you know.
And in August, I'm just like, we've really got to talk about these venues, everybody.
That's ridiculous. Yeah.
I'm a northerner. I'm like, it's 78 degrees and I'm sweating.
You'll burn.
Yeah. So I have a flute quartet that's actually being premiered in August.
Oh, right.
And that one is, I think, there's 2 very beautiful queer flutists that are going to be playing it with some very wonderful colleagues of theirs, all from the Texas area as well. And then in, I believe it's November, I'll be at the College Music Society's National Conference in Washington, D.C. And a colleague of mine is going to be premiering a piano solo called I Dissent. Also about just generally political, about calls for help. It uses the Morse code SOS rhythm throughout the whole piece to kind of just like calls for like what is going on right now and in the political sphere, and kind of genuinely feeling a little helpless on like the personal level. Like, how much can you as one person in tiny town Ohio really do to make impactful change? It's possible. It's difficult, and it's work. So it's finding ways to navigate those situations. But those are the 2 big things, and then maybe some sleep.
That would be you'll be able to finally sleep. Yeah. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Zachery, and thank you so much for providing the music. It's been really wonderful. So, and when you get some new stuff, come let us know and come back and talk to us again. It would be great.
Oh, it was absolutely lovely. Thank you both so much. I'm really, really happy that we had the chance to talk finally.
Us too.
So that's all for this episode. You've been listening to the Classical Queer Podcast, and Jake and I look forward to being with you next month. The incidental music was courtesy of Zachery Meier, and the show was produced by Samantha Jane.